Hello, I'm Andy Agafangelo. I'm carrying out this video interview of Abhishek in my capacity as chair of the Secretariat Committee to the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Personal Banking and Fairer Financial Services. I am also, however, the founder of the Transparency Task Force, which provides the Secretariat to the All-Party Parliamentary Group. Abhishek, thank you very much indeed for agreeing to have this conversation with me. As you know, the conversation is being video recorded. The video recording will be placed on the APPG's website and will raise awareness of it through social media and so on. You're carrying out this conversation with me on the basis that you have already provided a written submission to the APPG's call for evidence about the Financial Conduct Authority. Could I invite you first of all, please, Abhishek, just to tell us about yourself and outline just briefly to begin with how you came to interact with the FCA. Thank you.
Sure, thank you, Andy. So my name is Abhishek Sachdev. I set up Vedanta Hedging Limited in 2011. And what Vedanta Hedging is an independent derivative consultancy firm, largely targeted towards SME businesses, because there wasn't really anyone providing this in 2011. And we're the largest company in the country that's authorized to do this. So how did I come about with the FCA or FSA? So I first actually contacted the FSA, as it was then, the contact center in 2011, soon after I'd left the bank the bank I was working at, Lloyds Bank, to alert them about the potential mis-selling of derivative products, or IRHPs, interest rate hedging products that the FCA then called them, to small businesses. And I basically was effectively ignored. The contact center people I spoke to didn't really even understand what I was talking about, to be fair. And in fact, I think that's going to be acknowledged in the SWIFT report, which is going to be it's going to be released soon. So then I didn't know any journalists in those days. So I contacted an ex-school friend of mine who's now actually a member of Parliament, Matthew Warman. He worked at the Telegraph, and he suggested I speak to a banking colleague of his called Harry Wilson. Harry Wilson then went to the Times and is now at Bloomberg. So I met with Harry Wilson, the journalist, in sort of December 2011, and he liked this story. And then after a bit of toing and froing and also speaking to some other people, he then started a campaign in the Telegraph about the poor treatment of SMEs by banks with respect to derivatives. And you know, he got some nice catchy headlines, because you had one of our first clients was like a fish and chip shop business, for example, in Scarborough, you know, called Winking Willie's, who was missold derivative products. So then in March 2012, the FSA actually contacted me and asked me and one of my colleagues, Martin Barclay, to advise them on what these products were, and you know, understand them, and also to sort of potentially start thinking about how some redress may be paid to these businesses. And we were actually paid a small, modest fee for this. This then led to the creation of what was called the IRHP review, the Interest Rate Hedging Product Review, which, funny enough, the SWIFT report is about to sort of, you know, dissect and sort of look at the lessons learned from that, but that's a few months away. And funny enough, at that meeting, the FCA actually acknowledged to me, although they didn't do it in writing, that it was the Telegraph coverage which finally prompted them to start investigating this. And then I obviously told them it was me that led to the Telegraph coverage. And that then led to obviously the creation of the IRHP review, which has led to about roughly £2.5 billion of redress paid to about 22,000 SMEs.
Thank you very much, Abhishek. What is your interest in or connection with the FCA?
So my connection is, I've been authorized by the FCA when I was at Lloyds Bank as a derivatives advisor. We were authorized and have been since we started in 2011. It was called the FSA, now it's called the Financial Conduct Authority. And of course, we were paid that modest small fee in 2012 to advise them. And we've also provided advice to them subsequently to that, although unfortunately that then began to fall on deaf ears, which is why we kind of have the SWIFT review. But we weren't paid for any of that further advice in 2013-14 onwards.
Thank you. And beyond what you've already explained so far, briefly describe the interactions you've personally had with the FCA.
So, look, in addition to the above, we've met, I've met and advised sort of Julia Dunn and Christina Sinclair. They were the two senior directors who are at the FCA. Unfortunately, they've both left. Julia Dunn went to Nationwide. I don't know if she's still there. Christina Sinclair went to Barclays following Sir Hector Sands. Again, I don't know if she's still there. As well as there was a junior chap called David D'Souza, who was responsible for managing the scheme for a few years. But unfortunately, he then left and went to RBS to handle their regulatory team. So you can see a bit of a constant pattern here. In addition, actually, I hosted and chaired a meeting at my office in 2013 with the FCA, where all these people just mentioned came, Her Majesty's Treasury, the Government Insolvency Department, and other law firms, just to discuss how we try and help some of the most disadvantaged businesses, some of the ones that got into administration, liquidation, receivership, to potentially challenge the FCA review process, because a missold derivative could have actually put a business out of business, as it were. And that meeting was obviously reported in the Times as well.
Thank you. And in broad terms, Abhishek, what has your dealings with the FCA been like?
One word is frustrating. So let me be very clear. I feel extremely sympathetic to the FCA. I would not like to be in their position. They've got huge challenges. And I've said that to them since I first met them in 2012, because on the one hand, they've got to try and make sure the health of the banks is suitable, et cetera, because in those days there wasn't the PRA. But at the same time, they've got to try and help balance the redress to small business customers. But what's frustrating, however, which I find very difficult to accept and forgive, is when people like myself, and it's not just me, when other people like myself have been offering, and not even offering, we've been telling the FCA what's wrong with certain things to do with the IRHP process, how effectively they're being gamed by the banks, and the banks are kind of running circles around them. When we've been saying that to them in 2012, 13, 14, 15, and they've basically been falling on deaf ears, that is damn frustrating. And these points that we've been making, me and others, is exactly what's going to come out in this SWIFT report in the next few months, where it's a lessons learned document. But with respect, I would say to the FCA, what is the point of this lessons learned document? In fact, it was even mentioned in the Times today that it's going to be delayed again. What is the point of this lessons learned document in 2022, January, when actually no SMEs are really going to have any ability to legally or otherwise challenge the bank on the IRHP process? But again, the lessons learned that's going to come out in this document are the same things we were saying in 2012, 13, 14, 15. So that is damn frustrating.
Thank you. And just for clarity and to avoid any potential confusion about what you meant, I think you used the phrase earlier, being gamed by the banks. Could you just elaborate a little bit just to make sure that nobody misunderstands you?
So the banks, so again, I have sympathy here for the FCA, because I said to them, why can't you just make the banks do something? And they said, we can't use our statutory powers, because if we did, then it would take years and years of legal wrangling and fighting, and we want to make sure that we can help SMEs as quickly as we can. That's why they entered into a novel voluntary redress scheme. But what I mean by gamed by banks is, for example, the banks might say, oh, look, there's this really, really toxic product we sold this SME. Let's replace it retrospectively with a more cuddlier, friendly sounding derivative product instead. Instead of a structured collar, it's just called a swap, right? Or a collar. And that might make the FCA think, oh, yes, this is better. This is a less complex product. It's quite easy to understand. But in pound, shilling, and pence terms, the financial loss to the customer is actually going to be the same on both products. So yes, it makes the FCA think the bank is doing the right thing. But what matters is actually the redress that small business is getting is actually still no different to what it was under the original product. So that's one example of how these things are happening. And I genuinely believe the banks spent millions on, because it was the big four accountancy firms who are typically the independent assessors on behalf of the FCA, because the FCA can't be involved in every case. So the FCA hired the usual, I think they call it Section 166 persons or something, to be the independent assessors. But I believe the banks spent millions to save billions.
Understood. That's very clear indeed. Thank you, Abhishek. Have you ever experienced situations where interacting with the FCA has been helpful to either yourself or others If so, please explain what made the interactions helpful.
So there have been interactions where, look, every time I've met the FCA, they've said your information has been valuable to us and we have found it useful, right? The SWIFT report is going to acknowledge that as well. But, you know, and it's helpful in understanding the challenges that they're facing, because effectively, like a civil service organization, they work in incredible silos. There's like 4 or 5 different departments around the table: retail 2, retail 1, enforcement 1, wholesale supervision 2, you know, all these random departments. So it's helpful for an outsider to see all these different kind of silos that go on, and you can see why things kind of fall between the gaps. And look, ultimately, to put it bluntly, us instigating this Telegraph coverage and meeting with the FCA has led to redress that 22,000 businesses wouldn't have got otherwise. So that is a very big achievement from the FCA, and that mustn't be taken away, despite how frustrating you know, some of the challenges have been.
Thank you. And the next question is this. What are your thoughts on whether the FCA lacks the powers that it needs, or conversely, that it doesn't make good use of the powers that it already has?
Yeah, so this is interesting. You know, I don't think the FCA has enough powers, actually, because like they said, you know, they said it'll be too difficult for them to use their statutory powers to force the banks. Having said that, we do now have the senior managers regime, which should make things tougher. Funnily enough, I was at the Conservative conference last week, and the UKFI chairman, David Postings, an ex-banker who I know from Lloyd's days, said him and his members were very concerned about this new duty of care requirement that the FCA was going to be putting on the banks. And actually, if UKFI and the banks are worried, that kind of means the FCA is moving in the right direction, actually. But so I think they do acknowledge that they need probably some more powers to help the most vulnerable small businesses and retail customers. But unfortunately, you are going to find that the banks are going to strongly oppose this.
Understood. Thank you. Have you experienced any difficulties or shortcomings in your interactions with the FCA?
Yeah, and again, it started off, I think, quite well in 2012, but then later on, they refused to sort of start properly engaging. There was times when I wanted to even meet with them. So, for example, there was a time in 2016 when I contacted somebody there called Nausicaa Delphas, and I said, look, actually, I'm the one that sort of identified the IRHP mis-selling to SMEs. There's something similar that I've seen here to do with FX derivatives. Same sort of product, same type of products, same sorts of SMEs, but likely to be smaller scale. Can we please meet to discuss this? And she kind of refused to meet, even though I said, let's just meet for half an hour. And she said, can you put your concerns in letters and emails? I'm like, I'm so busy, it's hard to do that. And you can't explain all this just in a half an hour. You know, you can't do this by email or writing. But she refused to meet. But, you know, so that was also frustrating, unfortunately.
And have you experienced the FCA being reluctant to give clear answers to questions?
Yeah, particularly from sort of 2013, 14 onwards, when David D'Souza was effectively running the program. You know, he was giving very vague answers, not responding, et cetera, et cetera. And again, to be fair, it's not just to me, there's lots of others, you know, maybe 15, 20 other people like me, you know, ex-bankers, consultants, lawyers who are firing questions at him, but effectively just getting vague answers back.
Thank you. What's your perception of the culture of the FCA, and what do you think of it?
You know what? I think they're suffering. They're really struggling. There's an article in the Times today, I think, or another paper where it shows you the culture is really, really in a bad way. And it's a big problem Nikhil Rathi's got. I mean, that's today, right? I mean, they're talking about more people trying to join the union than ever before, because the FCA is feeling pretty beaten up, because it has criticisms for the mini bonds, the LCF, Connaught, this, that, all sorts of stuff. They're also regulating loads of CMCs, right? So I struggle, I feel a lot of sympathy for them. One potential solution I have, and again, I've mentioned it to others before, but it's never really happened, of course, is in, I believe in America, the regulators, they're actually allowed to keep their fines, right, that they pose on the banks. Whereas I believe here, the fines either go back to Her Majesty's Treasury, or they go to some charity, you know, like there used to be like a veterans charity or something. And those are good, you know, I'm not saying those things are wrong, but I believe that to get the best powerful quality of regulators, such as ex-bankers, et cetera, whether they're whistleblowers or not, you kind of need to incentivize them. And if you've got the best people there, by paying them good money, almost paying them almost bonuses and commissions, if they're able to elicit, find things and find banks, etc., which I think is like how the US system works, that I think would instantly change a lot of the issues the FCA has, but it's been falling on deaf ears for now.
I understand. Have you ever complained officially about the FCA?
No, I haven't.
Next question. What do you think about the possibility of conflict of interest issues at the FCA?
So good question. So funny enough, Martin Wheatley, who was the chair of the FCA at the time, and I think it was in 2011, actually said there was a conflict at the FSA. He actually said this in a Telegraph article, I believe, where he said that there is a conflict between kind of protecting SMEs, but not damaging the financial health of the banks. And they are potentially at odds to each other. Then in theory, that conflict has gone away because you've got the PRA, and then you've still got the FCA. But, I still think there is a bit of a conflict there, because you've still got, the FCA still has big supervision departments. And I still think that maybe there's a bit of a conflict between the supervision and the enforcement divisions.
Indeed. And do you believe there should be spot checks by the FCA on regulated and or unregulated entities, perhaps similar to the kind of spot checks carried out by VAT inspectors?
Absolutely. I mean, sometimes I think the FCA regulation is a bit of a mockery, to be honest with you. I mean, look, when I was at the bank for 10 years, we were authorized by the FCA, but what did it actually mean in practice? It meant our managers filled out forms, checked, the kind of a tick list, has this person done this, has this person done that. But did the FCA ever really come in and check any of us or check any of our managers? And it's a very light touch thing. One person from the FCA would only need to come in and spend a day on the trading floor to spend a bit of time with people, but they never did things like that.
And what positives are there about the FCA that you'd like to comment on?
The positives are that they do, they do listen sometimes, and they do have, an incredible amount of demands being placed on their resources. They have met me a number of times. They've come to meetings that I've organized in my office. They have made progress. And like I said, they still set up a scheme which forced the banks to providing that voluntary redress program for derivatives. So it's not all bad news. There is some good things. Then there are some good people there.
And, next question: if you could change 3 things about the FCA, what would they be?
The first thing I'd say would be listen to industry experts like myself who are telling them when things are going wrong. There could be whistleblowers, they don't have to be, but someone like me who understands derivatives is going to be able to pinpoint and challenge on a level playing field banks, because we deal with banks every day, more than 50 different FCA staff who might be lawyers, industry professionals, as they call them, or accountants. They're never going to understand this. Their heads are buried in the rule books and conduct rules and perimeter rules, whereas we're dealing with the actual banks themselves on a day-to-day basis. The second thing I'd say is the FCA should be able to keep the fines levied on banks to boost their resources and the kind of pay and everything at the FCA. And the third thing I'd say is, and again, this may not be down to the FCA, but I would increase the powers of the Financial Ombudsman scheme, which can try and then help take away some of those smaller SME type complaints that currently the FCA does deal with.
Thank you. The FCA is undertaking a transformation project. Do you have any comments to make about that?
Who isn't undertaking a transformation project, right? What on earth does that mean? It means let's look at culture, let's look at that. This is all just words, it's just management consultant speak, where you can go and hire Oliver Wyman or KPMG to help you with this stuff. I don't know enough detail about this stuff, but what I do know is that from what I'm seeing and reading in the press, the culture is at rock bottom of the FCA. So something clearly hasn't been transformed enough yet.
And last question, Abhishek, are there any other comments that you'd like to make?
Yeah, I think in addition to the Financial Ombudsman Service, the Business Banking Resolution Service, which is supposed to be a new scheme to help banks and SMEs, tackle the disputes, is effectively a chocolate teapot. In other words, it is useless. It was originally set up to try and help historical complaints and disputes like derivatives, like business support units, et cetera, but the very short answer is that right now, almost any SME which has got like a historical legacy complaint is basically being chucked out of the eligibility process of this business banking resolution service. And I don't think that actually businesses with legacy complaints are ever going to get proper redress now that this business banking resolution service has failed it. So what does that have to do with the FCA? Well, it does have something to do with the FCA because this is the banks we're dealing with.
Crystal clear. Thank you very much. Abhishek Sachdev, thank you very much indeed for not only providing us with your written submission, but also providing testimony by way of this video interview today, today being the 13th of October 2021. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you. Thanks. Bye.